This is part of the series where I talk about the ways people talk about narcissism without saying the word because it's such a cursed word. If you say someone's narcissistic, you're so judgmental. You're not supposed to say that. You shouldn't be diagnosing someone. Well, here's another way people talk about narcissism without saying it. They will say, they're intense. Now, this series is a way to sort of understand the sorts of strange little synonyms and sort of a narcissist thesaurus, that all the different ways people try to say it without saying it. It's a dirty word, right? Narcissism has become a dirty word, where in fact it's just really a list of qualities under the title. So people find different ways to talk about it that aren't so pathologizing. So let's talk about this word, which is intense. Intense. What does it mean to be intense? I'm not even sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, I do know that intense people tend to have a lot of conviction about a certain topic or certain situation. They may not be able to let something go. They may not be able to make small talk. They may have a blazing stare. They may be so impassioned about something that it may feel like more than you want to take on. Intense conversation during happy hour or something. Intense people may also be really disciplined. They may be really focused. They may get things done or be really devoted to a cause or a purpose. Intense people may fight for a position or a group that is often unheard. Now, intensity may work in certain areas of life. Like, I don't know, if you're an artist or if you're writing a book or trying to complete a really demanding task or going to school or advocating for a cause. Intensity tends to be a bit draining on close relationships because then some days all that somebody in a relationship wants to do is just take a walk in the park or watch a comedy or get the laundry done. The intensity doesn't always complement that so well. Now, in and of itself, intensity may not be a bad thing. A person can be intense and empathic. But at times, that when the intense person is intensely focused, they may not be as experienced as present as they could be. A person can also be intense but not entitled. A person can be intense and not grandiose. But, and I've seen this time and time again, there'll be a person who is clearly a narcissistic jerk, a public figure, and someone is writing about them or talking about them. And they'll describe that person as intense and not say anything further. It's very interesting. I was recently watching a news interview being done on a major network, and the conversation was between the news anchor, who was also a little bit of a jerk, and a person who was taking a very polarizing position on public health. And the person being interviewed, was an even bigger jerk. The news anchor was asking questions that were clearly experienced as antagonistic by the interviewee, who, like I said, was clearly not a nice person. I really didn't know much about the guy, but the things he was saying reflected a tremendous lack of empathy, a tremendous entitlement, and the things he was saying he really was very word salad. There was a lot of blame shifting, so I didn't know the guy, but I was willing to put a pretty good bet on the idea that the polarizing person was quite narcissistic. However, in the interview, he looked intense. I remember he was like this, the way he was leaning into the camera like this, staring with this rather intense gaze. He spoke rather flatly, and he couldn't engage in sort of normal social niceties in exchange. It was just like machine gun fire coming out of his mouth. He literally was incapable of seeing another point of view. I went and read about the interview afterwards. And the interviews about this guy, like the written articles about this guy, described this guy who like I said, in the interview seemed very abusive and gaslighty and mean. The people writing about him called him intense. I guess he was intense, but it was a lot more than that. Intense, like so many of the other words we are covering during this series, in and of itself, like I said, may or may not be a good or a bad thing. Someone who's working on writing a great novel, good for you. Be intense. Someone who is answering a simple question or cannot make even a tiny allowance for another point of view and then insults the person who has the other point of view, we could call that bad intense. But by framing it simply as intensity, we then tend to miss the other stuff about that person that is painful and antagonistic. It's interesting, as I've also been thinking about this video and this issue and this word, intense, the Olympics have been on, right? And I catch bits and pieces because, frankly, the piece that interests me is the psychology of an Olympian is so compelling to me, right? I know their psychology is definitely different than mine. When I read the interviews, all of these extraordinary athletes are intense. They had to be the best in these areas, to take the risks, to have the mental discipline and make the sacrifices and be singularly focused, often from a very, very young age. But in many cases, their intensity may have only been around their sport, right? I have no idea. We're not able to discern from these articles and these interviews what these people are like as just as people, because the interviews don't often give that much of a glimpse at the real them. Intensity in many areas, for example, like elite athletics, is a virtue, right? But that embattled, argumentative, oppositional, looks like they're about to explode if you say the wrong thing kind of intensity, to just simply term that as being intense seems to be missing the rest of the boat. As with so many of these terms, using these terms without seeing the fuller picture of personality can really drive enabling. Things like, oh, I know he's mean to you, and I know he's really dismissive and slams the door in your face, but he's just really intense. Or I know this teacher or this professor is hard on you and wants you to be your best and calls you names and invalidates you and just doesn't care. They're just intense. It becomes too much of a free pass and takes what can actually be a powerful, compelling, and even at times useful quality and turns it into an excuse for bad behavior. The fact is, intensity can be paired with compassion. Intensity can be accompanied by self-reflection, and definitely not all intense people are entitled. But when we excuse the emotional abuse and just call a narcissistic person's behavior intense, we confuse everyone, and we really do miss the difference between a person who is passionate and driven and a person who is unkind, invalidating, and abusive. So words matter, and using these kinds of words like intense, when you read them and yet you know other things about the person being written about, and you're like, that seems like more than intense. It does. And it's just sort of the way we try to soft pedal on these difficult personality styles, like narcissistic, somehow because we feel the need to make them so palatable. A month or so ago, I read an article in the newspaper, or online, whatever, talking about a sexually inappropriate politician, which that doesn't narrow it down, does it, who had to step down from their position. The writer of the article talking about this person called the pattern of behavior in him and others like him as gritty paternalism. Seriously? It literally made me laugh out loud. The unwillingness to just use the damn word narcissist because, they don't want to use a diagnostic term. It's not. But gritty paternalism is journalist speak for a narcissistic man who is angry, dominating, abusive, manipulative, predatory, entitled, arrogant, and who abuses their power. But it angers me to no end because the journalists have the big platforms, right? And they could be using it to teach, to use these public examples of narcissism and use them as a place to teach about it. And when they don't, when they call it gritty paternalism, they just become one more set of enablers. So this is part of the series where I talk about the ways people talk about narcissism without saying the word because it's such a cursed word. If you say someone's narcissistic, you're so judgmental. You're not supposed to say that. You shouldn't be diagnosing someone. And you might be saying, Dr. Romani, why do you care? I'll tell you why I care. Because the word matters. The word is descriptive, it often fits, it's not diagnostic, it is an observation. But when people figure out these workaround words, it means that for one more day, survivors of narcissistic abuse continue to be doubted. Now, after reading about this gross politician guy, my read on this term of gritty paternalism is really, in this case, a man who dominates, who is rude, who says what he wants and gets away with it because we file it under, well, they're really powerful and privileged. But when we call it paternalism, we make it more about a sociological phenomenon rather than something that happens far too often in one-on-one relationships, and it harms people. To label it gritty paternalism lifts some of the responsibility off of the person who is behaving badly and makes it more phenomena-ish, like gritty paternalism, it's about everyone. In some ways it's true. This so-called gritty paternalism is a structure that enables this phenomenon of abuse, and it's why pervy politicians and business leaders and leaders of all kinds get away with it for so long. People just go with the paternalism of it all. They write it off to generational and cultural differences, and for years and generations, they let it go. And obviously, that's changing ever so slightly now, after all this person stepped down from office, but did a lot of harm when they were in office. Now, this writer of this particular article had written about people and stories like this before, and again, wasn't able to see that these antagonistic and narcissistic patterns is what they were, rather falling back on words like gritty paternalism and intensity. There's actually something sort of cowboy in a Western movie feel to that, gritty paternalism, and not a person who actually destroys the mental health and the well-being of the people around them. An asshole is an asshole. And I don't care if it relates to paternalism or intensity or authoritarianism or their shadow or that hurt people BS. An asshole is an asshole. But when it starts becoming these bigger conversations about paternalism, then the conversation shifts to bigger stuff about masculinity and paternalism and all the rest of it. Don't get me wrong. These are very, very important conversations that we should be having. But alongside terms like gritty paternalism, can't we also see the word narcissism? Lift it up there, legitimize it a bit so people understand they're not alone in this. Because that's what this kind of behavior by a powerful person is. Low empathy, high entitlement, ultra arrogance, hypocritical, manipulative, abusive, power-hungry, gaslighting, narcissism. When the writers use the right words, then the people who read the articles actually see that their regular day-to-day narcissistic abuse story in their regular lives is actually playing out on a larger stage, that it is happening in state houses and courtrooms and corporate offices and all kinds of leadership spaces where people have way too much power that they hold through bullying and abuse. It helps people see that that big story in the news is simply a mirror of their personal story. I feel like there is a narcissism underground out there. A lot of you watching this video are part of that underground. People who talk about narcissism and narcissistic abuse on places like this channel, Reddit chats, closed social media groups. But the conventional media, the gatekeeper big players in media, they're very afraid of this word. And that concerns me because even though social media and all kinds of content is out there about narcissism, these media gatekeepers still hold lots of the traffic. And when they find the workaround words to talk about narcissism and antagonistic and high conflict personalities without saying a word like narcissism, they lose the opportunity to use their large platforms to draw attention to an issue that is harming people, that is harming families, businesses, and society at large. When people don't use the word, then it, in an interesting way, sort of invalidates the pain and continues to gaslight the confusion people are experiencing within these relationships. Well, if it's just gritty paternalism, when that fancy, powerful politician abused those people, then maybe my story is just about paternalism and I'm just making too big a deal about it. The self-blame, the self-minimization, and the self-gaslighting of people who are in narcissistic relationships persists when people aren't willing to recognize it. I understand why these journalists do it. I don't fault them entirely. Liability for the newspaper, editors not wanting to run afoul of attorneys, criticism from people who bring out that thing called the Goldwater rule, the idea that a psychologist or psychiatrist shouldn't call a person's mental health stuff out without meeting them. But here we go again. Narcissism isn't a diagnosis, folks. It's something I'm going to say over and over again. It's so interesting how we still want to keep pulling the wool over other people's eyes on this one. I understand, though. I understand the journalist conundrum. But in being so focused on covering their butts, it can leave even less clarity in a world of survivors that need more clarity. The narcissism underground we have created in channels such as this and in many others, on social media pages and other sort of less mainstream media, means that for the first time in history, the information about narcissism and what it does to people is getting out there. But the mainstream folks do continue to be able to sort of control the narrative on what we get to talk about when it comes to these toxic patterns. And they definitely still don't get it, or they don't want to get it, which is not good for all of the people out there who still do not understand what narcissism is. When you don't understand narcissism, you're either going to put yourself in harm's way or you're going to be an enabler. So it's absolutely crucial that not just all of us who've been through narcissistic abuse get this. It's important that other people start getting it too, so we can stop enabling these patterns that are doing more and more harm, not just to individuals, but to vast swaths of the population, and is harming all of us. People call narcissism or narcissistic behavior anger issues. So let's stop calling it anger issues. This isn't wrong. But it's like calling pizza cheese, or calling a rainbow just red, or an apple pie crust, or a car just calling it a steering wheel. Those things are integral parts of it, but they aren't the whole thing, and those labels miss a lot. These kinds of simplistic spins on narcissism also magnify the dissonance for those affected by these relationships, who can then say, yeah, this is a great relationship, but he has anger issues. Rage and anger are core issues in narcissism. They are a manifestation of the shame activation, the feelings of inadequacy popping out, the dysregulation and incapacity to manage in the face of frustration and disappointment. They are the way that narcissistic people maintain control in relationships because people are afraid of the narcissistic rage, and it's a form of tension reduction. The narcissistic person throws a big tantrum, and then they become more relaxed while everyone else is rattled from watching their meltdown. If you've ever been in any kind of narcissistic relationship, you know that rage and anger are key elements of these relationships. But the anger isn't the only issue. Many people in narcissistic relationships obviously become masterful at the eggshell walking ballet that is required to survive. And the better they get, perhaps the longer the periods between the anger outbursts. The eggshell walkers are, in essence, living in a sort of prison, and at least there isn't as much anger, though it's not possible to control some of the other sources that by issues raised at work, or an errant tax bill, or someone not liking their Instagram. The challenge is when it is simply spun as anger issues. It becomes easy to miss the equally and sometimes even more toxic patterns in narcissistic relationships: the invalidation, the manipulation, the gaslighting, the contempt, the derision. And by framing it as anger issues, it's easy to say that, this is just an anger issue, rather than seeing it as part of something more pervasive. Where this becomes a grave error is when therapists frame narcissistic patterns as anger issues. Because if it's just anger issues, then perhaps therapy that focuses on just anger will work. Now, that's not a bad thing, to work on the anger, but to work on the anger without addressing the other co-occurring patterns, it really misses the boat. And by and large, Anger management programs that do not address the core issues, such as narcissism or shame, don't have holding power. It's like walking through a hurricane with just an umbrella. It's not going to work. To address any antagonistic behavior and create meaningful change, a person has to be willing and able to take ownership, reflect on triggers, be mindful, and recognize the negative impact that this behavior has on others. In the absence of that, it's the equivalent of teaching a dog to not bark when the doorbell rings. People aren't that trainable, and narcissistic people are definitely not that trainable. I have worked with numerous people who have said they stayed in for decades in relationships with people they were told by couples therapists had anger issues, and in the worst cases would then be told, well, just avoid those trigger topics with them and things will be fine, or just teach the angry person to apologize each time. How many times can a person go through the cycle of rage, I'm sorry, rage, I'm sorry? It's like living with a leaky roof and thinking everything's fine on the sunny days. These attempts to frame narcissistic personality styles in these deconstructed ways is a way that people can talk about bad behavior without really taking on the deeper issues. Anger issues feel like something temporary that can pass or you can fix, that are sporadic and inconvenient. Anger issues is a way of framing it so a person can stay in the relationship and treating it like something just inconvenient, like someone who burps or farts or snores. The other challenge is that it becomes a way for other people to also minimize what is happening to a person in a narcissistic relationship. They may witness the rage and anger and also frame it as, oh yeah, I can see your partner has anger issues, but it really seems like he's a good dad, or don't take it so personally, she just has anger issues, which can then often result in a person in a relationship feeling that they're being too harsh if they think that the other person's behavior is far more reaching than just anger issues. Lots of people have anger issues, right? Not sure how it is that we live in a culture where having anger issues is actually acceptable. I know we're living in angry times, and without a larger framework to inform treatment or even to help survivors understand that what they are up against is more than just someone with a short fuse. No more than you would call your local pizza place and say sauce. It's just focusing on this one slice of anger and ignoring the larger picture, helping those who are managing narcissistic abuse, or even those who are trying to help narcissistic clients in therapy. It's really critical that anger issues are understood as one of many patterns in these relationships. But I'm telling you, I've seen a lot of people just try to say, oh, stop, Dr. Ramani, narcissism really just seems like some anger issues. Like I said, give it a shot. Call your pizza place tonight. Tell them sauce and hang up and see what shows up at your door. It's not just anger issues. It's a part of it. But I've not really seen a successful turnaround by just doing anger management training. This isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's a constant walking on eggshells. And most of us aren't built to go through the cycle of rage, I'm sorry, rage, I'm sorry. At some point, it takes a toll on you. But let's talk about main character energy. So main character energy, this is a thing, okay? And I am going to be definitely showing my age as I walk you through this video. I've had multiple people ask me if main character energy is the same as narcissism. It's not. I actually have to study up on this because main character energy is not a thing for a 56-year-old woman. It's hard for me to imagine anyone would want to witness the joys of me being the main character and folding laundry or emptying the dishwasher with me in the center of a performance art piece of me doing my household chores and saying, here I am, doing my life. It's just not something my age group does. Now, main character energy is definitely a concept that comes up in the social media era, right? In the healthy variation of this concept, it's also about taking charge of your own life, setting your own goals, and just being a good protagonist, like taking the lead in your own story. I think it's a bit of a distortion of what Carl Rogers and other humanistic psychologists intended to be self-actualization. Now, this idea of main character energy is also about making yourself the center of attention, the center of the story. It's as though all of the lights and the cameras are trained on you, and everyone else in the scene is a secondary player or an extra. Some folks who embrace this main character concept almost view everything in their life as sort of a short film, whether it's going for their morning run, getting their groceries, going out to dinner, cleaning the house, going on vacation. It's the cameras trained on you. You're imagining the soundtrack. Here I am, single gal, buying the makings for my pasta dinner on my movie night alone. Or look at me dressing up and making a grand entrance at dinner with my friends. That's the main characterness of it all, right? In the more sort of ostensible way. Now, main character energy needs an audience. And that's where we see sort of the incessant posting of moments in a life. Hundreds of millions of little films about people's lives every day on social media with them as the main characters. They're the central characters in their vacations, going to school, going to work, driving next to the ocean, at a concert. It's a stream of consciousness broadcasting, and there they are, the star of their own lives. So, okay, as a shrink, and not a young one, I love the idea. I got to tell you, I do love the idea of people grabbing the bull by the horns, viewing themselves as key players in their own lives, setting goals, putting themselves out there, honoring their voices. I think that's all great, especially young people. My generation carries different burdens than this young generation does. And I have to tell you, I love seeing empowerment at younger ages and living life on your terms. That part I think is great. Where this main characterness runs the risk of veering into narcissistic territory is when it becomes about needing the audience. So my question is, can a main character-driven person who has posted the quirky little, look at me buying the ingredients to make my sourdough bread, or being the central character in their various vacation pictures, would it be okay if there wasn't a lot of validation, or if there weren't a lot of likes and comments? Because if the main character energy person gets upset that nobody is tuning into their life, that's when I think it has taken a left turn onto narcissism lane. Or if the main character-driven pursuits mean that a person can't be bothered with the lives or needs or feelings of others, that the need to have a night curated in such a specific way means that anything other than the main character script then is greeted with contempt. Somebody comes dressed the way you don't want them to. Or that in the focus on the main characterness, that a person may hijack the experience or a moment that is important to someone else, like someone else's birthday party or someone else's celebration. If the main character lacks empathy, that's when this entire main character vibe starts to feel narcissistic to me. Main character energy with self-awareness and empathy, to me, is a person who is being assertive and agentic and standing in their power. All good stuff. A main character who is not self-aware or self-reflective or not empathic, well, that is just an attention-seeking person who may be more in the realm of narcissism and antagonism. Now, listen, I am not such a fuddy-duddy. And if you don't know what a fuddy-duddy is, look it up. I'm learning younger generation stuff. Y'all can learn some of my stuff. I'm not such a fuddy-duddy that I don't recognize the simple truth that social media and technology mean that all of us interact with the world and media in general quite differently now. And the fact is, these changes are permanent. Marshall McLuhan wrote, "First we build the tools, then they build us." Well, that's what's happening now. This idea of mutual recognition is a key element of every healthy human relationship and human development. The question is whether technology or people liking pictures on social media, is that really mutual recognition? It's pretty damn clear the tools are building us right now, and it's all shifting how our identities are shaped. Ergo, this main character energy. However, what does this mean for really important human experiences like mutuality? Can a main character hold space and recognition for the experience and the story for the main characterness of another? So what happens when two main characters meet? Because let's face it, you may be out there and doing your main character day, but someone else is too. And what happens when two main characters collide? If the mutual recognition is not possible, then I'm not a fan. A main character must have empathy. Without that, it's just narcissism. It's easy to write off this main character energy thing as just being attention-seeking and narcissistic, and in some cases I do believe that it's true. But if any of you out there can pull off your main characterness with empathy while maintaining awareness of the other and frame it as taking charge of your life and not just, look, I'm the star of my movie and of the movie of my life, look at me, watch me, appreciate me, be fascinated by me, and that you write off the people in your life just as being audience members, then that might be a little bit of a problem. That's an interesting moment, isn't it? But reflect on how you cope with the moments in your life when nobody is looking. If it doesn't matter to you whether it's 1 like or 10,000 likes, then you know what? I say enjoy your main characterness as a taking back of your power. But if this is being done as a numbers game and for validation and recognition, slow down and do a deeper dive. Because it means that your short movie of yourself with you as the star may not end up very well and could actually end up really lonely. Something to think about.